Subscribe, like, and comment now, because once this story starts, there's no turning back, and what unfolds inside these court records will haunt you long after the verdicts fade. The sirens cut through the freezing dawn like a warning meant for no one in particular. Red and blue lights washed over the marble steps of the old federal courthouse, reflecting off rain-slick stone as investigators pushed past reporters who hadn't yet been told what they were chasing. Inside, on the third floor, a janitor had made a discovery that would drag one of the most respected Supreme Court cases in modern history back into the light and into suspicion. A body had been found in the archive room. The man was slumped against a rolling shelf stacked with dusty case files, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him, his shoes aligned as if he'd planned to return for them. His name was Daniel Mercer, a former clerk whose work had once shaped a landmark Supreme Court ruling taught in law schools across the United States and Europe. A ruling that had changed lives. A ruling that, until this morning, no one dared question. Detective Elena Cross arrived minutes later, her heels echoing against the courthouse floors as she took in the scene. No signs of a struggle. No obvious weapon. Just a faint metallic smell in the air and a USB drive lying inches from Mercer's hand, partially crushed beneath his fingers as if he'd tried to hide it in his final moments. Cross had seen enough crime scenes to know when something was wrong. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. Someone wanted Mercer silenced, and they'd chosen one of the most symbolically powerful buildings in the country to do it. Within hours, the story exploded across news networks. Former Supreme Court clerk found dead inside federal courthouse. Questions swirled. Who had access? Why now? And what had Mercer been doing back among files from a case that was officially closed nearly 15 years ago? That case was known simply as Hawthorne versus United States. Back then, it was hailed as a triumph of justice. A narrow Supreme Court decision that expanded federal investigative powers in the name of national security. The opinion was elegant, persuasive, and devastatingly effective. Threats were neutralized. Convictions soared. And behind the scenes, Daniel Mercer had been one of the young legal minds who helped draft the reasoning that justified it all. But not everyone celebrated. As Detective Cross dug into Mercer's recent activities, she uncovered a quiet pattern. Over the past 6 months, Mercer had contacted 3 former defendants connected to Hawthorne. All of them had served long sentences. All of them had maintained their innocence. And all of them had recently filed appeals that cited newly discovered inconsistencies in the original Supreme Court ruling. That alone was troubling. But what came next was worse. One of those defendants, a software engineer named Lucas Brandt, had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. No bank activity. No phone pings. His apartment left untouched, except for one thing, a printout of a Supreme Court opinion, margins covered in handwritten notes. Notes that matched Mercer's handwriting. The investigation widened fast. Federal agents stepped in. Doors closed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when Detective Cross entered the room. This case wasn't just about a suspicious death anymore. It was about the integrity of the highest court in the land. Cross met with Judge Robert Hale that evening, a retired federal judge who'd been close to the Hawthorne decision. He looked older than his years, his voice shaking as he spoke. People think Supreme Court cases end when the gavel falls, he said. They don't. They echo. And sometimes those echoes come back louder. According to Hale, there had been disagreements during deliberations. Evidence the court never reviewed directly. Intelligence reports summarized, not disclosed. Arguments framed in ways that made dissent nearly impossible. At the time, it was justified as necessary. Now, someone was digging it all back up. Forensic analysis of the USB drive found near Mercer's body revealed encrypted files labeled only with dates and case numbers. One of them matched Hawthorne versus United States. Another matched a case that had never gone public, a sealed matter involving a confidential informant whose testimony had tipped the balance of the original ruling. That informant, it turned out, had recanted years ago. The deeper Detective Cross went, the more resistance she faced. Her supervisor warned her to tread carefully. Federal prosecutors stopped returning her calls. Even the medical examiner delayed releasing Mercer's full autopsy report, citing jurisdictional review. Then, late one night, Cross received an anonymous message. No name, no number, just a sentence and a location. They didn't just bend the law. They buried the truth. Check the basement. The message pointed her back to the courthouse. Against orders, Detective Cross returned after midnight, badge tucked away, heart pounding as she descended into the restricted lower levels beneath the archive wing. The air grew colder with every step. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she reached a heavy steel door marked records, restricted access. It was locked. She hesitated, then used a master key she'd borrowed without permission. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed far too loudly in the silence. Inside, the basement room was smaller than she expected. Shelves lined the walls, but they were nearly empty. At the center stood a single metal cabinet, dented and old, its drawers sealed with evidence tape dated 15 years ago. Cross peeled the tape away and pulled the top drawer open. Inside were original documents from Hawthorne versus United States, unredacted, untouched, and sitting on top of them was a handwritten note in Daniel Mercer's unmistakable script. 3 words that made her blood run cold. They knew it was false. And at that exact moment, somewhere above her, a door slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming above her echoed down the stairwell like a warning shot. Detective Elena Cross froze in the basement, the cold concrete pressing through the soles of her shoes as she killed her flashlight and listened. Footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Whoever was up there knew the building. And worse, they knew she was here. Cross slipped the handwritten note into her jacket and quietly closed the evidence drawer. Her pulse hammered as she moved toward the far exit, a maintenance corridor rarely used since renovations years earlier. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the space, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the courthouse's ventilation system. When she emerged into the alley behind the building, rain had started again, washing the city in reflections. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message was clear. She wasn't supposed to see what she'd just seen. By morning, everything changed. The official autopsy report for Daniel Mercer finally landed on her desk. Cause of death: acute poisoning from a substance that metabolized quickly and left almost no trace. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. No homicide. No suspects. Case effectively closed. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. At the same time, the disappearance of Lucas Brandt was quietly reclassified from missing person to voluntary absence, despite no evidence suggesting he'd left on his own. His appeal filing was removed from the federal docket overnight. When Cross tried to access it, the system returned a single line of text, file sealed by court order. The pattern was undeniable now. Anyone who touched Hawthorne versus United States too closely either vanished, died, or was erased. Cross sought out Maya Levin, an investigative journalist who'd built her career exposing judicial misconduct in Europe and the US. They met in a crowded cafe, noise masking their conversation. Maya listened carefully as Cross laid out everything: the basement files, the note, the USB drive, the pressure to drop the case. "This isn't about one ruling," Maya said quietly. "This is about precedent. If Hawthorne falls, dozens of convictions collapse with it. Careers end. Legacies burn." "And someone decided that was unacceptable," Cross replied. That night, Maya sent Cross a message with a single attachment, a scanned memo dated 16 years earlier, circulated internally among Supreme Court clerks. It referenced the confidential informant in Hawthorne, identified only by a code name, and flagged material inconsistencies in their testimony. The memo concluded with a recommendation: proceed anyway. The recommendation was signed by a name Cross recognized immediately: Justice Alan Crow. Crow was now retired, revered, and untouchable. His opinions were quoted globally. His portrait hung in law schools across continents. And according to this memo, he'd known the case rested on unreliable information and had allowed it to stand. Before Cross could respond, Maya's follow-up message arrived: "Someone's been asking about me. If anything happens, publish everything." The next morning, Maya Levin didn't show up to work. Her apartment was found unlocked, laptop gone, notes missing, no signs of forced entry. The police report described it as suspicious, but inconclusive. Federal authorities declined to assist. Cross felt the walls closing in. She returned to the USB drive recovered from Mercer's hand and worked through the night with a trusted forensic analyst off the books. When they cracked the encryption, the files revealed a hidden timeline of the Hawthorne case, draft opinions, internal debates, suppressed objections. And then, buried deep inside a folder labeled Contingency, was a video file. It showed the confidential informant. The recording was grainy, clearly never meant for public eyes. The informant sat in a small room, face partially obscured, voice trembling as they spoke. "They told me what to say," the informant admitted. "They said it was for the greater good, that the court needed this ruling. I never met the defendant. I never saw what they claimed I saw." The date stamp on the video was 3 days before the Supreme Court issued its decision. This wasn't just misconduct. It was fabrication at the highest level. As Cross absorbed the weight of what she was holding, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. "You're digging where you don't belong," a calm male voice said. Daniel Mercer understood that too late. "Who is this?" Cross demanded. "A friend," the voice replied. "One who believes the law only works if people believe in it. Exposing this would destroy that belief." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Within hours, Cross was officially removed from the investigation. Her badge was confiscated. Her access revoked. She was warned, formally, that any further involvement would result in charges for obstruction and theft of federal property. She went home knowing she was being watched. That evening, as darkness settled over the city, an unmarked envelope slid under her apartment door. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Lucas Brandt. He was alive, sitting at a metal table in a room with no windows, looking directly into the camera. Behind him, taped to the wall, was a printed Supreme Court opinion. Hawthorne versus United States. On the back of the photo, written in red ink, were 5 words. "Truth has consequences. Choose carefully." And for the first time since the case began, Detective Elena Cross realized the investigation wasn't just about exposing the past anymore. It was about surviving the present. The photograph burned in Elena Cross's mind as she packed a single bag and left her apartment before sunrise. Lucas Brandt was alive, but alive didn't mean safe. It meant leverage. Someone was keeping him breathing just long enough to control the narrative, and now they were using him to control her. She knew where this was headed. Courts didn't fear accusations. They feared proof, delivered publicly, in a way that could never be pulled back. Cross drove west, toward the outskirts of the city, where Justice Alan Crow maintained a private estate far from cameras and protesters. If Hawthorne versus United States had a heartbeat, it had passed through Crow's hands. And if anyone could explain why Daniel Mercer had died clutching the truth, it was him. She didn't arrive as a detective. She arrived as a ghost. Crow greeted her calmly, almost kindly, as if he'd expected her all along. His study smelled of old books and polished wood, the walls lined with framed opinions and honors from across the Western world. He gestured for her to sit. "You should stop," he said gently. "Not because you're wrong, but because you don't understand what you're breaking." Cross didn't sit. She placed the USB drive on his desk. "You already broke it," she said. "You just convinced everyone it was necessary." Crow closed his eyes for a moment, as if weighing whether the truth still mattered. When he opened them, the man beneath the legend finally showed. "Yes," he said. "The informant lied. And yes, we knew. But the threats were real. The panic was real. We believed the ruling would prevent something worse." "And Daniel Mercer?" Cross asked. Crow's voice lowered. "Daniel tried to undo the past. Institutions don't survive that. People get hurt." That was as close to a confession as she was going to get. Before Cross could respond, a phone on Crow's desk buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression tightening. "They've moved Lucas," he said. "You've accelerated things." Cross stepped back. "Who's they?" Crow met her gaze. the ones who ensure decisions stay final. She left before he could say more, heart racing. She knew now that exposing this through internal channels would end the same way it had for Mercer and Maya Levin. Quietly.
Permanently.
So she chose noise. Cross contacted an international consortium of journalists, outlets beyond U.S. jurisdiction, platforms that couldn't all be silenced at once. She sent everything: the USB files, the basement documents, the video confession, the memo bearing Crow's signature. She told them to release it simultaneously. At dawn, the story detonated. Headlines erupted across continents. Supreme Court ruling based on false testimony. Secret evidence buried for 15 years. Landmark case under global scrutiny. Governments scrambled. Legal scholars panicked. Appeals flooded in by the hundreds. Within hours, the Supreme Court announced an internal review. Justice Crow released a carefully worded statement expressing deep regret but denying intentional wrongdoing. It convinced almost no one. Then, Justice Cross allowed herself to breathe. The final blow landed. Lucas Brandt was found. Alive, but broken in ways that couldn't be undone. He confirmed everything. The pressure. The threats. The hidden rooms where inconvenient people were kept out of sight until they agreed to disappear. His testimony ignited congressional hearings and international investigations. It looked like justice was finally catching up. 3 months later, Hawthorne versus United States was formally overturned. Celebrations erupted among those wrongfully convicted. Laws were rewritten. Careers ended. Statues came down. And yet, something felt wrong. Late one night, Cross received a secure message from one of the journalists who'd helped break the story. "You need to see this," it read. Attached was a newly unsealed document from the Supreme Court archives, released quietly, buried beneath the noise. It wasn't about Hawthorne. It was about a different case. A more recent one. One that had used identical legal reasoning. Identical phrasing. Identical informant language. Cross scrolled, her stomach sinking. The signatures were different. The justices were different. But the lie was the same. The system hadn't collapsed. It had adapted. She closed her laptop and stared out into the dark city, understanding at last what Daniel Mercer had discovered too late. Truth didn't end corruption. It just forced it to evolve. And somewhere in another courthouse basement, another locked drawer was waiting to be opened. If you think this case was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Stay close, because the truth never stops knocking.